You think he doesn't see the fight? How often we tried before we fell? Or why we fell? You don't think he witnessed the tears as we fell? You think our bruises are lost on him? That he doesn't also witness the beatings that we face daily from a world that despises him and thus despises all who are for him? One of the strongest images in the New Testament is the parable of the prodigal son, or at least the parable that we like to call the parable of the prodigal son. And one of the strongest images in the parable is the father pleading with the older brother about how right it is to rejoice in the homecoming of his younger brother. Homecoming obviously being presented as the single most wonderful reunion imaginable. If there was a better setting, then I'm sure that Jesus would have been capable of painting a parable in that type of setting. When reading the parable, especially in my younger years and in my earlier preaching, I've often been mad at the older brother for, spoiling the party and ruining the reconciliation with the father's youngest son. But it's evident from the parable that the father loves the older child too and wants him to be part of the celebration, especially, I imagine, because it's a welcome home party. That God is for the guilty. Well, that should make everybody happy. Indeed, I believe it's following the woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, that Jesus weeps, laments over Jerusalem. And maybe God is angry in other places which are, worth being discussed, but even God's anger only exists to destroy that which made him angry in the first place. And even in his anger, he always acts redemptively, always acts lovingly, always acts true to himself, not only in favor of those sinned against, but also in favor of the sinner. Fairness and justice will have their say, and the judge of all the earth will always do what is right. But even God's wrath and judgment are exercised for the good of the human family. There's never a divine tantrum, for he wishes that none should perish. So Genesis chapter 21, way before Abraham ever offers Isaac in sacrifice toward God, here in chapter 21, he is called to offer Ishmael for the sake of Isaac and for God's overall redemptive purposes, which, may I remind us, includes Ishmael and Hagar. If you do the math, Ishmael is a teenager by now, around mid-teens, and no doubt loved by his father, even if not by Sarah, for it appears that Sarah has witnessed some inappropriate behavior from Ishmael toward Isaac, and she fears the threat that he may eventually present to her son. In Sarah herself, we're being shown that Sarah's earlier mocking laughter when she received the news that she would give birth in her advanced years is now replaced by righteous laughter from a mother at being able to give birth. that which was initially used against God and his promise, or at least directed against him in distrust and unbelief, is now being used to glorify him and his promise. And in that, if nothing else, we're given a glimpse to an emerging biblical pattern, God turning the world on its head, with no greater example of this, of course, being the cross itself. Unfortunately for Sarah, this episode reveals, again, a dark side to her character when it comes to Hagar and the child, Ishmael, that she demanded be born. Nevertheless, even though Sarah's motives are far from righteous, which undoubtedly Abraham has picked up on and consequently resists, which is why God gets involved, I believe. Even although Sarah's motives are far from righteous, the actual thing she suggests, the removal of Hagar and Ishmael, is the right thing to do. And God reassures Abraham that he'll look after them. Ishmael will also become a great nation. And because God will look after the boy, then it would be obviously to Hagar and Ishmael's profit to be removed from a mother who cares nothing for him and is clearly despising him at this point, especially in light of having her own child. Now the situation, I can't imagine, would get any better for them both. Sarah's words, "Come everybody, rejoice and laugh with me." Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would ever nurse children? Who would have said it? God said it. Sarah, God said it. That's who. Who would ever have said? God. And although there are many fine things that Sarah did, both in the service to God and her husband, this chapter goes down as another loss for her, especially when we'll remember that she, Sarah, is the architect of this disaster with Hagar and Ishmael. The end does not always justify the means, and Sarah can find no comfort in the fact that her evil plan was actually the right thing to do. Just because something is the correct thing to do doesn't mean those who ascribe to it are righteous. Correct things are not always done with the correct motive. Right things must be done with the right motive for them to be righteous. Isn't that why we despise politicians so much? When we find them actually doing something right, we end up discovering that they only did it because they owned shares in a particular stock that would benefit them. In other words, they only did what was right because they personally benefited from it. Jesus would later say, if you love those only who love you, what credit is that to you? It's to God's never-ending glory that all who will eventually lose out in salvation will have no accusation of favoritism to lobby against him. For he sent rain to the righteous and the unrighteous. He blesses all of humanity without partiality, without favoritism, and always with the purest and cleanest and greatest of motives. God doesn't only do things right, he does them with the right motive, something that was lost on the Pharisees and upon many religious people down through history and even up until today. They ignorantly believe that God is the great behavioral referee in the sky, interested only in right things. And as long as we get the behavior correct, as long as we can tick the correct religious boxes, as long as the formula is correct, well, there's no need to remind a group like this that Jesus took a flamethrower to that particular house and burned it to the ground. In fact, Jesus often engaged in or supported what they considered to be unrighteous behavior and justified it all on motive alone. David eating the showbread, working on the Sabbath, the altogether proper behavior of a woman one evening letting her hair down in public and washing a man's feet with it, to the embarrassment of the religiously correct. All down through the prophets, God almost talks himself hoarse, lamenting over worship that seeks to do nothing but placate him. Get the right animals in the right number, in the right order, in the right place, on the right date, and our heavenly Santa Claus will be happy. You and I both understand that the God of the Bible has never been satisfied with cold, shallow religion, and has always exposed it as a trite, pathetic excuse for existence. Friendship, companionship, fellowship is what our God is after. It's what he's always been after, and that ought to delight us to our core. Even after 18 chapters ago, when we took paradise and threw it back in his face, and all the time since, still he comes chasing after us like some love-struck sweetheart, like a dog with a bone, with all the love of a parent, simply finding himself incapable of giving up on that which he loves. So if anyone understands Abraham here having to bear with separation, it's God. God knows what it's like to be separated from a child. And Abraham's hesitancy or resistance toward the idea of separation is nothing short of godly, which of course is why God comes rushing in to reassure Abraham that he'll not only look after him, but because of Abraham, he'll build an entire nation from him. That Abraham would be grieved at the loss of his son doesn't seem to trouble Sarah at all, as long as she gets what she wants. Not good. Not good at all. Spouses are not meant to be at peace when the other one is upset. Nevertheless, and as painful as it is, Ishmael must be cut off, but only because it's the right thing to do in regard to God's promise toward the entire human family. And God working and bringing salvation to the world in spite of human evil is arguably the greatest theme that emerges from the pages of our book. Again, the cross standing as the definitive example of that. God working with and in spite of human behavior, in spite of the opposition that comes his way, in spite of the evil, often using the evil to accomplish the good that he has brought to us down through the ages. In other words, God bringing salvation to you in spite of your own personal sin is what he has done collectively down through history with the entire human family. Cutting off that which we love in favor of or in service to God, whether it's our right eye or our right hand, whether it's a friendship or a behavioral practice, or in this case, a son, although understandably difficult to do, is what God asks of Abraham. And Abraham, to his glorious credit, delivers again for God. This can't be stressed enough. Look, if God asked of you something this grand, this meaningful, this difficult, at least you have Abraham and everyone after him as an example, plus multiplied millennia where you know and can often prove that trusting God is the right thing to do. Abraham had none of that. Abraham didn't have Abraham. It's no wonder why God was terribly fond of this man and why God trusted Abraham so much. Therefore, and that brings us back to the point I'm beginning to wear myself out by saying it, that the Bible is not about us, it's about God. The story of Abraham, even Abraham's greatness, even although every time we speak about him, we keep hearing sermons about Abraham's faith in God. Well, as helpful and as sometimes necessary as that is to hear, that's not what the biblical text is being written to reveal, except by incident. The biblical text is being written, as we know, to reveal God. Therefore, if we fail to see God's faith in Abraham here, and God's delight in Abraham here, we're missing the point. We are meant to see Abraham's faith in God, but in seeing Abraham's faith, we're meant to see the type of behavior or attitude that delights God. Abraham's behavior is being presented to us as that's what it looks like when you get it right. That's my boy. That's what I love. It's God who's being revealed here. We're being given a glimpse into what God delights in. And in Abraham's case, it's a God who delights in humans, who, while being far from perfect, seem to insistently, willingly, and repeatedly come to God for their direction. Ultimately, come to God for his direction and offer him their love and friendship in return for his. Humans who understand the relationship and embrace it for what it is and not have to change it every 5 minutes to suit them. That delights the Father. That's not to say that God remains callous or unmoved when we're called to sacrifice those things that are dear to us. Who are my mother and brothers? Jesus asked, and answered it, my mother and brothers are those who hear the will of God and do it. You don't think that pained Jesus a little bit as those words tripped over his lips? Now, I don't think for one moment he's putting Mary down here. After all, she was one who supremely heard the will of God and obeyed it, saying first to God, this is my body given for you, way before Jesus ever said it to us. So he's not putting Mary down, but he is elevating everyone who hears the will of God and does it to her status. But in doing that, well, doesn't every boy desire to believe that his mother is just that little bit better, walks that little bit taller, graces the world that little more definitively than everyone else's mother? You don't think Mary had a special place in Jesus' heart, his own mother? I'm not saying Jesus wouldn't have meant what he said. If anyone ever meant the things he said, it was Jesus. I'm just saying that if the biblical witness is correct and that Jesus was all man, well, I've seldom met a man who didn't hold his own mother in special regard. So if anyone understands sacrifice, separation, it's God in this situation with Abraham. And listen, not only does he understand it, not only can he sympathize with it, he admires it and praises the individuals who do it. This is the God we serve, with a high priest who's not unable to sympathize with us in our weakness, but one who is also able to beam with unashamed pride at being called our brother. Listen, the big calls in life, those times when we must walk against the current or the tide, those times when loving God means loss in this world, when we have to turn our backs or have backs turned against us, those times when a godly wife or a godly husband must deny the wishes of their spouse and bear the home consequences because of it, or godly parents having to deny the wishes and desires of their children. Hey! Oh, I hate that noise. I don't know if I've shared that with you before, eh? Sarah puts peanut butter inside one of his little toys and he licks it out to the most disgusting sound I've ever heard in my life. And him drinking from the bowl only reminds me of that. So now, man, talk about suffering, the big calls in life that I've been called to suffer. A dog licking peanut butter from a toy. Has anyone ever suffered? Excuse me while I delight in my own pettiness. Or those times that God calls us, the big times when we pray for our enemies, albeit through gritted teeth sometimes, at least until we can do it and mean it. Those times when through gritted wallets we pay our taxes, knowing what those savages are going to spend them on, or when we might otherwise get away with it. Those times when we're called to forgive someone who has wounded us deeply. Those times when we refuse to take advantage of our employer, even although all the other employees might hate us for it. Those times when we'll hide our pain and disappointment in order to spare others from having to share in our suffering. He doesn't ask these from us from a callous, aloof, or removed position. He isn't even calling us to such things simply because they're right. He asks these things from us because ultimately he knows they're good for us. And good for us is something our God delights in. You think your God is ignorant of just how difficult the fight is here? You think he doesn't know? You think our failings are all that he sees? Is that all you see in your children? You think he doesn't see the fight? How often we tried before we fell? Or why we fell? You don't think he witnessed the tears as we fell? You think our bruises are lost on him? That he doesn't also witness the beatings that we face daily from a world that despises him and thus despises all who are for him? You think that pain is hidden from him? that because we will not bend the knee, we are hated because of it. You think our shame and regret are hidden from him? You think he doesn't know how good you would be if you could only find the strength to do it? Why won't he give you the strength to do it? Because his grace is sufficient. You think your tears and your heartache fall upon deaf ears? McGuigan never seems to tire of reminding us that God doesn't only see us as sinners. He sees us as sheep without a shepherd, as people who have been sinned against. And that could preach for another hour or so. But suffice to say this, that we can have these moments like Abraham is doing, that we can have those moments and make him proud, that every now and then in the ring we actually land the odd punch where we send a god flying to the other corner of the room, that we can make him proud, that we can speak for him, ought to blow our minds. After everything we've done, individually and collectively, that we don't have a God sulking somewhere beyond the clouds, a God that we have to somehow, collectively gather ourselves and go and try and coax him back into fellowship with us. The reverse being true. We have a God whereby if we spent an entire lifetime in abject rejection of him and decided at the last minute to turn around and try and find him, we don't find him a lifetime away. We find him right behind us, saying to us, I was hoping you'd turn around. Welcome home. And the God who heard Ishmael in this chapter, which if you'll remember is what Ishmael means, is the God who hears you. And the God who saved Ishmael is the God who'll save you. For he who promised is faithful. And that is the God that the chapter is testifying toward, a God who hears and a God who saves. He is not a man that he will change his mind. So, straighten up, stiffen that spine, wipe those tears, trim those lamps, and strengthen those knees. For he who promised is not only faithful, he's on his way. Thoughts, comments, questions?